Thank you, Massimo. So I would like to talk about policy space, because of course this book is also about policy recommendations, and so I would like to present a brief summary of these policy recommendations. And in particular, what's the main objective of the book was to identify a policy space in the international trade arena for developing countries. And before that, I would like to contextualize a little bit this, and I think it is important to mention that 2 points. The first point is that there were some failures in terms of international cooperation concerning food security, development, and international trade during the last 15 years. Okay? So these two failures were first, of course, the Doha Development Agenda, and second, the policy reactions during the surge of international food prices in 2007-2008. Concerning the Doha Development Agenda, you remember that it was launched in 2001, and it was launched with the hope of supporting development and even fighting terrorism, because it was linked at this time, and it did not happen. Okay, so nothing was delivered, or almost nothing, while all the evaluations point out that there is some gains from what has been negotiated during all this time. So if you look at what is on the table still today, if you try to evaluate what is on the table, the gains are positive at the world level. It is limited, okay? So it's small gains at the world level, something like 0.1% in 2025 in terms of global real income, an increase by 2% of trade, so it's not a lot, but it is positive. We have to understand why it is so limited. In fact, it is limited because of flexibilities. I think this is the most important point. Because of flexibilities that have been introduced during the negotiations for political reasons. So I think most of it is political economy reasons that has implied some flexibilities introduced in the negotiations, like, for example, sensitive products and other clauses. Okay, so the gains are positive as when they are evaluated traditionally. I say that because, in fact, we can have a new look at it. We can say, well, there is a different picture of the gains given by the Doha Development Agenda. It is potential cost of trade wars. You see that, you know that, in fact, trade wars now, unfortunately, they are threatening. I mean, there is a president in the US who is threatening frequently some partners of US trade wars. I just want to mention that there is a discussion paper that we just released with David on that. You have also some fears of protectionism just after the financial crisis in 2007-2008. And the problems with trade wars is that governments can raise tariffs, and of course it amplifies with rounds of retaliations and counter-retaliations. It amplifies the losses of everybody, okay? So with a new trade round, we decrease the bound rates, that is to say the maximum duties that governments can imply. So it means that a new look at the gains from the Doha Development Agenda is to evaluate that the potential cost of trade wars are reduced with a new round of trade negotiations. And if you look at the book, we had made this kind of evaluations with David, and it means that the gains are much bigger than we were expecting traditionally. The second failure in terms of international cooperations is policy reactions to the surge of international food prices. You know that, so in 2007-2008, the global agricultural markets have been marked by a big increase in terms of world prices. And in fact, what happens is that I don't think the source of this big increase was trade policies, but it was amplified by trade policies. And in particular, governments reacted by imposing export restrictions and export duties, and also in importing countries by decreasing import duties. So it means that the supply on world markets is reduced and the demand on world market is increased by this double movement. So it means that the natural reactions of governments was really uncooperative. So it's a very important point that I would like to mention. There are 2 chapters in the book that evaluate this, and we have to come to the conclusions that it is a failure in terms of cooperation, international cooperations. My second point is about the recent evolutions of trade policies. In fact, during the last 15 years, in fact, the trade liberalizations has continued, first by multilateral liberalizations, because in fact it was the end of the Uruguay round, if we take into account the 2001 as a point of departure, but also by unilateral liberalizations. So there are countries that decrease and it's a natural movement from themselves that decrease their custom duties at the border, and there are also regional agreements. So there are other forms of trade liberalizations. Second point, which is really important, it's the evolutions of agricultural policies. Cool. The big point, so it's completely different now, the contents of the agricultural policy as compared to 2001, the beginning of the Doha development agenda. It is important, this, because you have to keep it in mind for the policy conclusion. Now the agricultural policy in rich countries are less trade distorting than 15 years ago. Okay, so it's a really important point. In fact, technically, the governments in rich countries have tried to change the policies from what we call the amber box to the green box in particular. On the contrary, in emerging countries like China, for example, and India, we have seen a big increase in domestic support with very much trade distorting measures. So I think it's something which is very worrying, and we have also to take it into account. So all this is explained in details in the book, for example, with a chapter by David Orden, and also his colleagues Lars Brink and Giselle Datz, and also in another chapter by Joe Glover. And also Fusseini Traoré is talking about the cotton sector. So what is important here is the fact that you have this change, this complete change of trade policy, agricultural policy, and also right now you have the big issue of food stocks. Okay, so there are more and more governments who wants to set up food stocks in terms in the preoccupations of responding to food security. So what is important here is the fact that the issue of food stock is quite important, because very often food stock have too many objectives when they are set up. In particular, there is food emergency aid, which means that it's a quite legitimate objective, but also redistributions, and the problem is that many food stocks are being implemented in order to support farmers' income. So it's also a big issue. So I finish with which policy space. I do not want to give you too much in order to give you incentive to read the book, but which policy space? We think that WTO rules are very important, because non-discrimination is very important, because national treatment is very important, because transparency is important, because binding of policies is important. We think also it is important, WTO, because it offers a dispute settlement procedure. And this dispute settlement procedure, we have tried to look at it, not in this book, but in another discussion paper, which has just been released by IFPRI. And it is relatively fair in terms of treatment of developing countries. So the WTO is the best framework to continue trade liberalizations. We think that a new round of multilateral trade negotiations must be set up, must be revamped. It's difficult to identify a package that satisfies everyone. So we try to indicate in this book some directions for this new round of multilateral trade negotiations that we call. So, for example, we think that the domain of negotiations must be extended, okay? We do not have to negotiate by sector, but we have to negotiate from a global point of view, covering all the sectors. We think also that the plurilateral approach is also very interesting. This new round, I'm going to finish with it, has to incorporate some new disciplines on restrictions, export restrictions and export taxes. It is very important because of this failure that we have noticed and which is very damaging for poverty. And also we have to insist on the role of transfers, cash transfers or in-kind transfers, which are also at the household level the best way to fight food insecurity. Thank you very much.